All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the conference. The first session will be sort of focusing on retirement. Not that we are ready to retire yet. The first speaker is Jamie, who will talk about costly attention and retirement. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Christian just said, my name is Jamie McCuish. I'm an assistant professor at HEC and a research associate at the IFS. And before I jump into it, on a personal note, I just want to say that when I was a PhD student, the DSE summer school was the summer school I most wanted to go to and was never able to for various reasons. So I'm really delighted to be able to present now at the conference. So thank you to the organizers for putting me on the schedule. The title of the talk is Costly Attention in Retirement. So what's it about? Well, one implication of inattention is that households cannot fully exploit features of the benefit system they are unaware of. And one particularly well-documented lack of awareness of the benefit system are mistaken beliefs about pensions. For example, Mansky documented substantial uncertainty about current social security formula in the USA. And in my data, I observed both true and self-reported state pension ages, which are like the early retirement age of the UK system, because it's the earliest age from which you can claim benefits. Now, at first, these mistaken beliefs seem quite surprising because this information is, one, freely available. Your state pension is a deterministic function of your gender and date of birth, and two, financially relevant. But I would argue they become less surprising when we acknowledge that, firstly, attention is costly. Our cognitive resources are finite and limited. It's difficult to pay attention to things and think them through. But also that policy is uncertain. Governments can, and sometimes do, reform pension policy. And when you combine those two things, it may be optimal not to learn the current policy, making mistaken beliefs less surprising. So, can costly attention to an uncertain policy explain these mistaken beliefs, and what are the implications for retirement? More specifically, my research question is, can costly attention to a changeable policy, pension policy in particular, explain both observed mistaken beliefs and puzzling aspects of retirement behavior? And I say brackets in the UK because this puzzle has wide external validity, and I believe the explanations I'm proposing may do too. I've labeled this puzzle an excess employment sensitivity puzzle, and it is, why do people retire exactly at pension eligibility ages when there are so few incentives to do so? So the UK provides very weak incentives to retire exactly at state pension age, and yet labour market exits concentrate there. Similar puzzles have been observed in multiple other countries, amongst them Switzerland, Germany, and the USA. And of course, other explanations are possible and have been proposed, for example, reference-dependent preferences or norms. But as complete information explanations, these other explanations do not also account for these mistaken beliefs or why they should correlate with people's employment response to the pension age. If there's time at the end, I hope to come back to discussing reference-dependent preferences and comparing my paper to that explanation, because I think that's kind of the leading explanation in the literature at the moment. What do I find? Well, I find the answer to this research question is in the affirmative. Yes, observed mistaken beliefs arising from costly attention help explain the puzzle. They close 43 to 88% of the gap in employment drop at state pension age between the baseline model's predictions and the data. So, costly attention increases the employment response at the state pension age, but selection into state pension age knowledge means the model also replicates the negative observed relationship between mistaken beliefs earlier in life about the pension age and the employment response when you get there. Estimated costs of attention are small. The mean household has a willingness to pay to learn their state pension age of the order of £11 to £83, but relatively large employment responses follow because, firstly, those near retirement are close to participation margin, and secondly, the response at state pension age represents an intertemporal shifting of employment as compared to the frictionless baseline, meaning that the welfare implications of this relatively large bunching of labour market exits are modest. To get to these conclusions, I develop a solution technique for dynamic rational attention models with history-dependent beliefs. Most dynamic rational attention papers suppress the belief distribution as a state variable. My solution technique will not. And having this endogenous belief distribution as a state variable means I'm able to match my model predicted beliefs to the subjective belief data I have to identify the cost of attention. Now, normally when I present this paper and I'm a bit constrained on time, I try and focus in on the application and the results. But given the theme of this conference, I'm going to concentrate more on the solution methods, but hopefully not to complete detriment of the application. So I hope to at least present the main results. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the related literature, but I'm happy to take questions on that. Okay, the context. So I study this puzzle in the UK context, as I mentioned, and the UK is an interesting context in which to study this excess employment sensitivity puzzle, because many potential explanations for a concentrated employment response at pension eligibility ages are really ruled out in the UK context. Firstly, UK law prohibits compulsory retirement ages. That is, it's considered age discrimination to force someone to retire purely based on age, which obviously rules out firm mandated retirement, causing this bunching of labour market exits at state pension age. Next, the state pension is not conditional on employment status. That is, you get to a certain age called the state pension age, and you become eligible for a cash transfer from the government called the state pension. You do not have to stop working to claim this money, and indeed many people carry on working past claiming. You might worry that creates tax incentives to stop working at that age. That's really not the case. The tax incentives are very limited because simultaneously upon reaching your state pension age, a component of your income tax actually removed, so your income tax liability is reduced. Taken together, we can really think of the state pension, at least the first order, as just the anticipatable increase in your non-labour income. Now, in a standard complete information model, there's no reason for a concentrated labour supply response at an anticipatable increase in your non-labour income unless you are liquidity constrained. So I will use whether liquidity constraints can explain this employment response as a proxy for whether standard complete information models can do so. Yes. Yes, Oxford and Cambridge. That's that caveat button. Very quickly. So there are some exceptions to this, basically used by Oxford, Cambridge, and very elite law firms. So you can have an employer justified retirement age if the objective is of public interest, it's consistent with the social policy aims of the state, and the policy is proportionate. Oxford and Cambridge have these, I think St Andrews as well, and some elite law firms. Oxford's justification is that it helps intergenerational fairness. But they actually lost a court case saying that that was not a proportionate policy, and they had to put this guy back into work. So they're very limited and legally a bit unclear. So they lost this case saying the policy wasn't okay. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand why that they still have the policy, but yeah. Thank you. To investigate these questions, I'm going to use a reform which increased the female state pension age from 60 to 66 in monthly increments from 2010 to 2020. And I use it for two things. I'm going to use it firstly to causally estimate the impact of the state pension age on employment. And let me just say, maybe I thought it was maybe implicitly obvious in answer to Ario's question that, so there are those caveats, but Oxford, Cambridge, and elite law firms are a very small part of the working population. So I kind of abstract away from that. Yeah. And I also use it for another thing. So to causally estimate the impact of the state pension age on employment, and I do that using a difference in difference methodology, but I also use this reform to estimate the extent of Objective policy uncertainty about the state pension age, basically using the occurrence of past reforms to estimate a data generating process for future reforms. The reform was legislated in 1995, which means it's an anticipatable change with a horizon of at least 15 years. So the reform itself didn't introduce any reason for a concentrated employment response at state pension age. It's still true that there shouldn't be an employment response there unless you are liquidity constrained. To estimate this model, I'm going to use, to investigate these questions, I should say at this point, I haven't showed you the model. I'm going to use ELSA, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. It's a representative panel survey of the population aged over 50, and it's similar to HRS in the USA or SHARE in Europe, if you're familiar with those. It's linked to admin data, which is useful for few key points. And I just realized that I really should say on this slide, more relevant, it has very nice subjective belief data on pension policy. Okay. I'm just going to now present you some motivating evidence for sort of the key empirical facts, just to make sure everyone's on the same page before we jump into the model. This motivating evidence is just going to be some pooled averages on graphs. There is some more rigorous empirical analysis done. If there's time, I'll get to that after the model and the solution method jointly with my results. I want to do it that way to jump to where my contribution is, which is the model and the solution method. Okay, the first thing I think it's good for everyone to have in mind is the reform. So here you see on the x-axis date of birth and on the y the female state pension age. And you can see before this reform in green, all women had a female state pension age of 60. Then after the reform, it's increased in these monthly notches. And there's a subsequent reform that accelerated the rate of change for later born cohorts. All I really want you to take away from this now is that the state pension does change in ways over the course of these women's life, working life, that surely wasn't predictable when they started working in the 1970s. Okay, excess employment sensitivity. So to illustrate this puzzle, I've plotted here on the x-axis age relative to the state pension age, on the y the hazard of exiting the labour market. And you see a clear jump in the hazard of exiting the labour market at state pension age. To get at this question whether liquidity constraints can explain away this result, I break the population into those with above and below median liquid assets in the interview immediately before their state pension age. And we don't see a significant difference between the two groups. Sort of arguing against liquidity constraints, completely explaining this jump in the hazard rate. Okay. When I do, so the wealth I do there, that's non-housing, non-business wealth. You mean the one I used to break into two groups? Yeah. Is pension wealth much bigger than non-housing, non-business wealth overall? We don't observe any markets for borrowing against future income. So it's not illegal, unlike in the USA, but there's no market for borrowing against your pension in the future, particularly your state pension. And this is the state pension age, which is different from the private pension age. So I model the private pension system, which is a larger fraction of people's total wealth and total pension income, but it doesn't correlate with the state pension age. Good, good enough for now. To illustrate mistaken beliefs, I've just got here a bar plot of the difference between the error in self-reported state pension age at age 58. Okay, so on the x-axis, I've got the difference between the true and the self-reported state pension age. And I bin this to a yearly frequency because my model only has yearly periods, but the true answers are monthly. So what we see here is that the plurality of these women know their own state pension age to within a year. That within that group, there are many who are mistaken by various months, about 40%, but about 40% of them know their state pension age to within a year. That still leaves, though, the majority of these women mistaken about their own state pension age by over a year when they're within 2 to 4 years of eligibility, which seems like a very wide margin of error so close to pension age itself. Okay, onto the model. I'm going to start with a standard complete information baseline model of retirement to which I make two novel contributions. Firstly, the introduction of objective policy uncertainty. And then on top of that, rational attention about this policy uncertainty to try and capture the fact these people do hold these mistaken beliefs. Okay. I'm just going to present a high-level summary of the baseline model to try and push on to my contributions, but I'm happy to go into more details if there are questions. So in the model, we have women, they're aged 55 to 101. They're married or single, and they're high or low education, meaning there are 4 types, and exogenous processes and functions are going to be type specific. They face uncertainty over survival, wages, and employment. They make decisions about consumption, labor supply, and savings in a risk-free asset. They receive non-labor income from spousal income, which is a function of age. The state pension from the state pension age onwards, which is going to be a parameter I vary to mimic the reforms, and private pensions from a type-specific private pension age onwards. And these pension functions are functions of lifetime earnings. And these women households are going to get utility from consumption, leisure, and bequests. The first kind of novel feature I introduced to this is uncertainty about the state pension age to try and catch the fact that governments can and sometimes do reform the state pension age. And to do that, I'm going to make the state pension age stochastic. Okay, and so we've got this stochastic variable SPAT. But I want to be very clear about this. This is not, you shouldn't think of this as me trying to infer what my state pension age will be from the current state pension age of currently retiring cohorts. No, this is the best information available in the model about what your state pension age will be when you get there. So it's like what the government's currently announcing your state pension age is as the member of a given cohort. So I say the government updates a cohort state pension age following this process. Each period, they're going to hit it with a shock because it's Bernoulli 0, 1. Obviously, that's a really simplistic model of a stochastic state pension age. Why do I do that? Because although there are past reforms on which I do estimate this to try and tie my hands a bit about the extent of objective pension policy uncertainty, there just aren't that many reforms to estimate a very flexible functional form. But it does catch the fact that, at least in recent history, governments have tended to increase, but generally not decrease, pension eligibility ages. And I'm going to estimate the probability of reform in any given year using the final state pension age of reform-affected cohorts. Okay. Oh, yes. That won't ever happen with this. That won't ever happen with this functional form, will it? Because your state pension age can increase by at most a year within each year. It cannot. It's ruled out by that functional form. But I mean, if on my potential to-do list is, I can't estimate more flexible functional forms, as I said, but I think I should maybe do some more robustness about this. And if I have a functional form that did allow multiple increases in 1 year, which would be realistic, no, I would grandfather people into the scheme. So I think that, which I think is the more realistic assumption. But here it's grandfathering by functional form assumption. Yes. Yeah. No. Yes. Yeah. In the model, actually, I also abstract away from the claiming decision. That's because there's in the model, in reality, you have a choice to claim. In the model, once you get to the age, you get the money. There's no claiming decision. The reason I do that in the model is to avoid another puzzle, which I look at a tiny bit in an appendix, because the deferral option during this period was more than actuarially fair, and yet 90% of people claim immediately. So I think that's potentially another paper. No, it's function of your earnings. It's years contributed and earnings. Yeah, it's a bit of a messy path-dependent function because of they don't want to change it for people in different cohorts, et cetera, but basically it's a relatively flat compared and relatively low compared to other OECD countries function of a combination of your lifetime earnings and your years contributed. Okay, now onto the second novel feature. That's rational inattention. Good. And that's a slightly more involved extension of the model. So I'm going to just 2 words of notation before I talk about that. I'm going to introduce a decision variable, dt, that groups together the consumption and labor supply decision, and states other than the state pension age. I'm going to group them all into xt, just for notational convenience. Now, what does the model look like in this version of the model with just policy uncertainty, without rational intention? Well, the states are going to be xt, everything else, and the stochastic state pension age, and households are going to choose decision rules in terms of their state in order to solve this Bellman equation, subject to intertemporal budget constraints, intratemporal time constraints, and borrowing constraints, where utility is something a bit like this, a bit like a CRRA. How does this change when I make the household rationally inattentive to state pension age? Well, the first change is that the state pension becomes a hidden state variable. What do I mean, a hidden state variable? It's still a state variable because it's payoff relevant, but the household no longer directly observe it, which means it shouldn't enter their decision rules, right? Which brings us to the next change. They no longer base their decisions off the true value of the state pension age, but the beliefs they hold about what the state pension age is. These beliefs are going to be models of complete belief distribution over all possible state pension ages, and so introduces a new high-dimensional state variable. This belief distribution is a function of the full history of signals received up to that point. What's this full history of signals? Very good, I haven't mentioned that yet either. That brings us on to the next change. The decision process now becomes like a 2-step process. In the first part, the agent, the household, the woman, chooses her signal function. She specifies a noisy signal of the hidden state pension age. And she's able to specify that very flexibly by specifying any conditional distribution on the hidden state pension. Then the household's going to get a realization of this signal and make their decisions based on the things they already observed and the new information they just received to maximize their utility. Now, the household chooses this signal function, right? So they can make it as precise as they want. In fact, they can choose to be fully informed. However, they're going to suffer a disutility for choosing a more informative signal function. And that disutility is going to be directly proportional with constant of proportionality lambda, which I call the cost of attention, to the mutual information between the current state of knowledge as captured by the belief distribution and this signal function chosen. For anyone who doesn't know the mutual information function, it's a concept from information theory that precisely captures the amount of space required to store or transmit the information in one random variable about another. But don't need to worry too much about that for the rest of the talk. And then to round off and complete the model, next period's beliefs are formed by Bayesian updating, and the state pension age is revealed upon reaching it. So there may be quite a bit going on there. Let me just recap quickly the within period timing. You start each period with some states, one of which is hidden, the state pension age, then able to choose a signal function to give you some information about this hidden state variable. You get a realization of this signal, and then you make choices based on what you observe, and then states update, and you go to the next period. Now, you may be thinking this is all very complex. The state pension age is just a number. I can go online, look it up. Why all this complexity? Well, yes, it is just a number. You can just go online and look it up. It's also just a number in the model, one you don't observe. And you can go on, and you can in the model go online and look it up and remember it and assimilate it into actions by choosing a degenerate, perfectly informative signal function. But I would argue that's going online, reading legislation isn't the only way people learn about policy changes. They also learn from talking to other individuals and from newspapers, for example. And in both those examples, there's something that's random and there's something that's a choice, right? It's random whether there's a newspaper story today about pension reform. It's a choice whether you read past the headlines or skip straight to the sports, which is why I think this kind of choice of a signal function is a good modeling device for a messy real-world process of information acquisition. Yes. Not, yeah. That's a result, not an assumption, but yes. Yeah. Okay, you might also be wondering, how does all this help explain the drop in employment at state pension age? Well, notice now that arriving at the state pension age becomes two things, two additional new things. It becomes a positive information shock, reducing your precautionary labour supply motive. It also becomes a positive wealth shock. And it's always a positive wealth shock at state pension age because you age past earlier alternative potential state pension age. So you may get negative shocks as you update your beliefs along the path, but when you get to state pension age, the earliest you can get this money now is today. So when you get that information that it is today, that is a positive wealth shock. And so as leisure is going to be a normal good, that's going to also introduce another mechanism to create a concentrated employment response at state pension age. Okay, onto the solution method. Now, they know it becomes, yeah, the only thing they don't know is their pension age. Yes. The pension amount, you mean the level of benefit? Yeah. That would also be a surprise. So the first point would still hold about the pension, the level of the pension benefit. The second point obviously doesn't, but yeah. Yeah. I concentrate on the pension age just because there's better subjective belief data about it. So I could model it more clearly, but yeah. So but the first point would still hold, right? It's still a positive information, exogenous information shock. And you would still also have uncertainty about the age that was revealed. So I think adding both would amplify the mechanism. Okay, so the problem's been complicated by the introduction of a high dimensional state variable and the belief distribution and a high dimensional choice, the signal function. Now, previous work in rational intention has tended to either maybe indirectly restrict the choice of this signal function, maybe by imposing specific utility functions like the Gaussian linear quadratic case, or eliminate the belief distribution as a state. Now, that can be a really good assumption in specific examples, and it's often justified, for example, by information sharing assumptions. But I think it's obviously not fully general. Sometimes we do hold differing beliefs, and that is important for our actions. And it does turn rational inattention into a model of learning that says that beliefs don't matter. So in this paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose a solution method for dynamic rational attention models with history-dependent beliefs, i.e. not suppressing beliefs as a state variable. How do I deal with the computational difficulty? Well, I'm helped out by results from two theory papers. Firstly, very centrally, by results from Steiner, Stewart, and Mateka, who provide analytic solutions for f of t for a very wide class of dynamic discrete choice models, rational attention models. Let me say here how general this is, because although I'm going to illustrate my solution method through the lens of my model, it does apply basically to anything you would apply Steiner, anything that fits inside the class of Steiner, Stewart, and Mateka. So there's no restrictions on the uncertainty that the agents are learning about. They can be learning about anything. No real restrictions on the utility function. But the only sort of substantive restrictions are its discrete choice. So from here, I have to discretize my choice problem. I use 500 grids for asset points and 3 labor supply level choices. And the other, maybe slightly substantive assumption is the cost of attention has this functional form. It's additively separable and directly proportional to the mutual information. So Steiner, Stewart, and Mateka basically tell me what the solution is. But actually calculating the solution is not really computationally feasible, just brute forcing it because of this high dimensional state variable, the belief distribution. In dealing with that, I'm helped out by results from another theory paper by Kaplan, Dean, and Leahy, who showed that rational intention very generically implies consideration sets. That is, there's going to be many choices that the households never take. They just assign 0 probability to. And the upshot of that is the solving conditional choice probabilities are going to be sparse. They're going to have many zeros in them. And I'm able to check for this sparsity ex ante, which, although it doesn't reduce the size of the state space, it reduces the amount of computation required at each point in the state space, greatly mitigating the problem of a high dimensional state space. Okay. As I said, I'm running behind where I wanted to be, and I said I wanted to go to present these results. So the solution method. So very quickly, I'm going to go over the results from Steiner, Stewart, and Mateka in order to actually present you the solution method. So if we go back to that timeline I presented you before, and on this timeline, as maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, I kind of faded out the state pension age, right? To represent the fact this is hidden from the perspective of the household. It's what they have to learn about. But from the perspective of the econometrician, the state pension age is not hidden at all. It's just a deterministic function of gender and date of birth. What is hidden from the econometrician's perspective is the realization of the signal and the choice of a signal function. So let's flip this now to the econometrician's perspective. The problem looks like that. And since we don't observe this step in the middle, and we have households making a choice based on something that's unobservable and stochastic, we don't really lose too much by rolling that into a single choice of stochastic actions or conditional choice probabilities. Once we've done that, we can just substitute out for the f of t, the signal function, by the conditional choice probabilities and the cost of information. And we get something that looks like this, where this new term yt is going to be the unconditional choice probabilities corresponding to those conditional choice probabilities, i.e. the probability of making a choice averaging across all possible state pension ages. Once we've done that, we've completely got rid of the signal function. The problem, everything's expressed in terms of CCP, so we can just take first order conditions and solve. And with this entropy-based cost of attention, you get a logit-like result. Not quite the standard logit because you have this endogenous Q term on the right-hand side. And to find that Q term, you can just solve the log sum exponential for Q. Now, my basic solution method is just solve 2 and substitute into 1, but that hides a few problems. The first one that maybe some very eagle-eyed people might have noticed is that the value function depends on beliefs. Beliefs are formed by Bayesian updating, which means I need the full distribution of actions in order to know how good a signal of a given state is having taken given action. So I get around that problem by a very simple guess and verify iteration approach. I guess a value of Q. That gives me the next period's beliefs, conditional on having taken an action. That allows me to form the conditional continuation value. I solve 2 to get a new value of Q and then iterate to convergence. Once I've done that, I substitute into 1 to get the CCPs. That's the brute force version of the solution method. But as I mentioned, I'm able to avoid actually solving 2 at many points in the state space due to this sparsity. There's a few ways I'm able to check this, but I'm just going to explain the simplest one because I think that's very, very intuitive. The first thing I do with this problem is I remove all strictly dominated alternatives because these households are rationally inattentive. If there's an alternative that's strictly dominated across all possible realizations of the state pension age, then they're never going to take it. But sometimes doing that just leaves me with one action, in which case I've solved the problem. And that happens at quite a few points in the state space. But even if it doesn't, removing strictly dominated alternatives greatly reduces the dimensionality of this problem, so speeds up the solution. Okay, that's the solution method. I won't say, maybe I shouldn't, but I do want to say one very quick thing here. You might see that and you think this is the logit-like result we've got is almost exactly the same to Rust. It's a dynamic logit. So you might think it's very amenable to CCP estimation. Unfortunately, we've got firstly this endogenous Q term, but also we've got a high dimensional, potentially unobserved state variable, the belief distribution. So although that's actually something I'm currently thinking about in this project, I'm just going to use this solution method to do full solution estimation. And I'm going to estimate the baseline model using 2-stage simulated methods at the moment, targeting the pre-reform employment and asset profiles. That's the fit I get for the baseline model to those 2 static profiles. What I'm then going to do next is I vary the state pension age in order to mimic the reform, to look at the employment response to the state pension age as it varies. Why did I do that? Because I want to investigate the excess employment sensitivity puzzle. And to do that, I'm going to try and replicate treatment effects that I estimate on the data. I do not have time to show you the treatment effect estimations. Yes, Soratio. In the no, if so. Let me say, so that's not too much of a consideration on the period that I'm estimating. If you remember right from the beginning, so I said this reform was legislated in 1995 and it began to get rolled out in 2010. And then I'm estimating on the first few years of the rollout. So there's not really any change along that dimension in my data, but I agree with you, actually, that would be, yeah, a nice feature to have in another version of the model, possibly, yeah, related. I could maybe use the 2011 reform, but yeah. Okay, so I'm trying to estimate these, match these treatment effects. So with the baseline model, this is the treatment effect, that's like basically that jump in the hazard at state pension age for the whole population and for those with above median liquid wealth. You can see the baseline model really misses the treatment effect. Introducing policy uncertainty alone doesn't help much. It could potentially, because those mechanisms do exist in the model with just policy uncertainty, the ones I mentioned before, but the extent of objective policy uncertainty that I've estimated just isn't large enough to give it any bite. Can we get some bite, though, from these mechanisms if we amplify the cost of attention, sorry, the uncertainty in the minds of the agents by introducing rational intention? Well, to do that, I'm going to now introduce a new parameter, so I need to pin down that parameter somehow. And I'm going to estimate it from the evidence of learning. So I showed you before these women are very mistaken about their own state pension age at age 58, but they're actually far more mistaken at age 55. Sort of clear evidence that they're learning. And we see the blue in the data in blue and the model in green. And I use that drop between 55 and 58 to estimate the cost of attention. And this is captured as the reduction in mean squared error in self-reported state pension age between 55 and 58. When I do that, I find I need a lambda that implies a cost of attention that implies a mean willingness to pay to learn your state pension age today of roughly £11. And to do that, I get a substantial improvement in the treatment effects. They move substantially closer to the data, and the treatment effect in the richer subpopulation now falls just inside the confidence intervals, but it misses it in the whole population, and it misses it in the whole population, and the point estimates are quite far below. But it's improved greatly from the baseline model. But let me just say here that if I'm to compare myself to the literature in what I'm doing here, the reference-dependent preference approach to this problem also introduced the free parameter, the change in the marginal disutility of work at state pension. And those papers tend to use that as a free parameter to directly target this puzzle, whereas I'm tying my hands using this belief data. What do I get when I directly target the puzzle? Well, I get a much better fit. I explain a lot more of the puzzle. But now I find I need a much larger cost of attention of £83. But I mean, I don't want to do that because I do think a nice feature of this model is that I am able to match this belief data, also explain misbeliefs, and tie my hands on the extent of the information friction. So what potential explanations are there for why I sort of undershoot the puzzle here? Well, maybe misbeliefs are a complementary explanation to reference-dependent preferences. And maybe circling back to something Pedro was asking about, well, maybe I've understated the extent of objective policy uncertainty by loading it all onto the state pension age, because there are many facets of the pension system and people are confused about basically all of them, I think. I think I'm basically out of time. Can I take, I just have 1 minute to say something about the counterfactual I have, which, I mean, I just say it from here. I do a counterfactual policy experiment, which is I look at the increase in employment generated by pension age reform, so increasing the pension age. And I find you get a larger overall increase in employment in the model without information frictions, which at first might seem in contradiction to what I'm saying here, but it's not, because rational attention generates a concentrated employment response at state pension age that the informed household will make earlier. Think about this. If you're 55 and you find out your state pension age is increased, you're going to work more. If you don't find out, you can't have that employment response until later. So I find that sending information letters to try and inform people is a benefit to the household and a benefit to the government budget. Thank you very much.